Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us. My name is Thomas Walker. I'm the Director of Inclusion and Equity Education, one of the offices in Student Affairs here at the University of Denver. We want to thank you for joining us for today's conversation. On the screen, you can see a list of our panelists who will be joining us today, and we appreciate them giving their time and perspective with us today. I'm going to say a few notes just to kind of frame the conversation before we jump into that with them. I want to mention a few logistical pieces for our webinar and time today with our audience as well. First, thanks to our organizers and sponsors, the University of Denver Community Plus Values initiative for gathering us, and we'll mention some other of our sponsors and organizers and provide some links to them and other resources toward the end of our time together. But those include the DU Cultural Center, my office, IEE, DU's Human Resources and Inclusive Community Division, and our Staff of Color Association. If you are joining us on a video, we won't be able to see you, but do have the Q&A function available. So if you roll over your Zoom screen toward the bottom, you'll see that option. Again, we're not going to be doing a Q&A, but if you've got a pressing something, one of our staff who are working kind of in the background may be able to help with that. We also have turned on the auto transcription function, which is an automated captioning program. You can adjust that, turn it off, adjust the size of the font by rolling over your Zoom screen. There's a button for live transcription at the bottom in the control bar. So please feel free to use that. But again, just making that accessibility available for those who want it. And again, my colleagues, if there's anything else I am forgetting, please let me know and I will add that. A few notes just to set the stage as we begin our conversation. Oh, one other logistical thing. We initially planned our time today for an hour, but in some discussions about the need to really give everyone more of a chance to talk and to really go a little deeper in the issues, we've extended to 90 minutes. And so we'll be going until 12:30 today. If you're not able to join us, that's okay. We are recording and we'll make the full video available on the C+V website, but just did want to give that heads up that we've added some bonus time in order to engage a little bit more with one another. So we will be going until 12:30. Please stay as long as you can join us. Some framing notes before we get to questions and have our panelists introduce themselves. As spring quarter begins on campus, the weather is improving and increased COVID vaccinations raise hope for more opportunities to safely gather together soon. At the same time, we are not done with the medical pandemic that has affected us all, though its costs and burdens have not been shared equally amongst all in our societies. In the United States, we continue to grapple with racial, economic, and political divides that are not new, just more apparent and seem more urgent of late. Globally, climate change, the digital divide, and other tensions strain within and across nations. And most immediately, we in Colorado have experienced the latest in a series of mass shootings coming on the heels of another in Atlanta 2 weeks ago. Another just happened in California last evening. And I saw a report on CNN that since the Atlanta spa shootings, there have been 20 plus mass shootings, 4 or more people injured in the United States. And that's just in the last fortnight. So lives stolen, communities impacted, questions raised, action needed. But what action, by whom, how? In short, even as spring and the spring term begins, we are dealing with a lot. Today, as that new month, new season, and the new DU academic term begins, we're taking a few minutes to pause, to reflect, and to connect in the hope that the attention, voice, and sharing can provide some comfort and perhaps a little healing, and hopefully some renewed and continued action for the public good. We are not seeking agreement among or with our panelists today, nor are we promising to cover all angles or to fix all problems in our time together. But we are joined by 5 community members who generously and at the last minute agreed to give their time to share some of their struggles, thoughts, and intentions. I want to stress that our panelists are here as individuals, not as representatives of their organizations or larger identity communities. And while we don't and can't represent all peoples and perspectives in any brief session, our neighbors do bring a range of roles, identities, and experiences to the conversations. We'll have them introduce themselves as they respond to the first of our 4 major questions we'll consider today. Again, my job is to kind of keep the conversation going to facilitate. I hope that we will be able to communicate amongst each other. And as we converse, we encourage our audience to listen, even and perhaps especially when we don't agree or understand fully, and to consider what you and your communities are experiencing, what you and your communities need from one another, and what we all can do to heal and build even through trying times. Though that's just, again, some framing to get us started. We're going to begin just kind of with a check-in on where we are, the folks that we have gathered today, with an inventory of thoughts and emotions. Panelists, we'll just have people go. I'm just going to go by the order listed here on the screen. So have you introduce yourself, a little about yourself, and what you have personally experienced and or what you have witnessed other people experiencing in the wake of the recent events. What have you felt and thought? What are you hearing from those around you? Anne, would you mind getting us started?
Of course, thank you. Thank you, Thomas, for convening us and giving us this opportunity to reflect and talk together. My name is Anne DePrince. I am a professor of psychology here at the University of Denver. I also direct DU's Center for Community Engagement to Advance Scholarship and Learning, which we fondly call CECL. Wearing both of those hats, my psychology research focuses on violence against women and violence against children. And my work through CECL, of course, focuses on how do we collaborate together to do more, to become more than the sum of our parts. And so I have found my thoughts and emotions really filtering through both of those roles that I play. I've been thinking a lot about the interconnections between mass shootings and violence against women that we know for many perpetrators of such mass violence, they have histories often of violence against women, or the shooting itself is in part intimate violence directed at people that they are in relationships with. And that perspective through my scholarship as well as through CECL just makes me acutely aware of how none of these issues that probably will come up today, whether it's racism or violence against women or mass shooting or gun violence, none of those can be solved in isolation, that these are interconnected. And I think when in recognizing that things are interconnected, I think sometimes that can feel really overwhelming. And that's certainly what I've heard from people in my communities and networks, a sense of a hopelessness of again, to have our country opening up from the pandemic and have that mean more gun violence is just maddening. And yet, if we can, where I find a bit of hope is that if we can recognize the interconnections of issues that we're passionate about, I think we have more potential for collaboration and action. So those are some of the pieces moving around for me these days.
Thank you. Maria?
So my name is Maria Corral. I'm the Community Integration Coordinator with the City and County of Denver's Office of Immigrant and Refugee Affairs. I grew up in West Denver as a little girl. My family has an immigrant or migrated into the area we now know as Colorado. And what I felt as and thought of as late is how inundated my feed is with so many instances of hate. And with the shooting last week in Boulder, I think it all kind of came to a head where for me personally, at first I didn't feel anything. It was just like another shooting. And then I had to check myself and be upset and get angry and cry and grieve, because now there's one more thing, that normal everyday item that we just can't really do anymore without thinking about where the exits are located. How would we get out if we were in that same situation. And I think, you know, my daughter since middle school has been receiving these drills, and it's such, and it's coming from such a place of hate that it hurts me. And I think to protect myself from being hurt on a day-to-day basis, from being emotional on a day-to-day basis, I decompartmentalize the violence and the danger that we all face from day to day, so that I can move forward and do things that progress and help the community, at least in my small way. But I think we have to be kicking and screaming. I want people to be kicking and screaming. I want people to be pissed, because I'm so tired of money from certain organizations feeding our legal and policy systems and having more value than my life, than that of my daughter and that of my community. So, and those are, that echoes the same thing that I'm hearing from our communities. They're doing so much good and trying to maintain right now during a worldwide pandemic, that they're focusing on the good and trying to move past all of this, and still trying to protect each other as well. I mean, unfortunately, I feel that these violent occurrences are just even creating more silos in our community, when we should be reaching out and holding on to each other.
Thank you. Tim?
Hi, my name is Dr. Tim Chen, graduate of DU's GSPP, Graduate School for Professional Psychology. I work in private practice in downtown LA, focusing on couples, adult individuals with anxiety, but also college students, because we have a very close connection in our group practice to USC. So in my personal experience in the past months, actually, thinking about the violence against Asians that's been in the news, my experience is that I grew up in a very Asian community in a suburb of LA, 72% Asian graduating class. And as I was hearing about this, in the zeitgeist, there was more violence. I felt unsure. I had to look up numbers. There was uncertainty. Was this really increasing? Was this some kind of spin? And then the violence in Atlanta happened. And that felt much more present, a little more scary. And it's this odd thing where it's both close in my community and far. It's not here with us. We don't think about it day to day. But it's something that worries us, worries me when I go to sleep at night. Is my mom going to be okay? So that's the close part. The further part is, I think I've had maybe 2 conversations, 3 conversations with just random groups of people about this, but it's not on our back door for whatever reason. But there is this potential. And so what I'm here and what I hope to do here is to help us build some more understanding of these recent events, to help us still feel connected, feel even with those that we might disagree with, still feel community. Because even as we attempt to make sense of these tragedies, I think that oftentimes we can quickly go to anger. We can quickly go to places in which defenses might rise and make it difficult for communication to continue.
Thank you. And Zahida?
Hi all. So yes, my name is Zahida, and I'm relatively new to Denver. I moved here from Vancouver, Canada, just over 2 years ago. I serve the community through programming with a focus on the Muslim community, immigrant, refugee, and youth population. I have a BA in anthropology and sociology, and I guess a few areas that are important to me are equity, leadership, emotional and mental wellness in the community, and just amplifying youth and marginalized voices. And I currently work as a crisis counselor as part of the LFS Colorado Spirit Wellness Program, which is providing emotional support to the community during the pandemic. So my feelings lately have been a culmination of thoughts and feelings over the past year, really. I empathize with my fellow Muslim community as we constantly live in a fear of Islamophobia, the Asian American Pacific Islander community as they experience ongoing hatred and backlash and racism. And then, of course, BIPOC victims of police brutality and injustice, Black and Indigenous folks particularly. And as we create these supportive healing spaces for the community, I also repeatedly think about the systemic racism in the institutions that are supposed to make us feel safe. And the stark contrast there is in how white people or white passing people are treated as opposed to those that are Black or colored in general. And when one minority community is targeted, it just feels like we're all hurting. As a Muslim female person of color, I'm hurting, and we all should be. I'll be honest, I'm also desensitized sometimes. There's so much hate that there are times when I don't feel like thinking about it or talking about it for my own personal self-care. And I can only speak for the spaces in which I've been in. The Muslim friends and community I've connected with here locally and also in Boulder, across Colorado. They're not only living in fear of the fact that they could potentially be or could have been a victim of violence by perpetrators of violence, but also that the identity of the shooter is Syrian American. So we're not only trying to heal from the tragedy, but also living in fear of the racist Islamophobic backlash that can ensue at any point from the community. It's just a whirlwind of emotions, really.
Thank you. And Allison?
Good morning, everyone. My name is Allison Baer, and I'm an iRise postdoctoral fellow in the Department of Psychology here at DU. And I'm a social psychologist, and my research is focused on how external social forces influence the physical and mental health outcomes of stigmatized group members. Perhaps because of my research interests, when events like this happen, I wonder, what are we doing wrong as a society? What aspects of our values, culture, beliefs, and practices are creating the conditions that support these events? And there's good reason to consider this question. I recently saw a statistic that said that 5% of the world's population is in the United States, but 1/3 of the world's mass shootings between 1966 and 2012 were here. So this suggests something is happening here to support these outcomes. And the question is, what is it? So I was reading an article by Metzel and McLeish called Mental Illness, Mass Shootings, and the Politics of Firearms. And in this article, they're challenging some of our beliefs around gun violence. For example, the belief that gun violence is caused by mental illness, or the belief that gun control can't prevent mass shootings. And they conclude that mental illness is not the most significant predictor of gun violence. For example, alcohol and drug use, childhood abuse and domestic violence, and male gender are all more strongly associated with gun violence and mental illness. And they also suggest that we examine some of the symptoms created by being in a society where we're surrounded by guns, the mass psychology of needing so many guns in the first place, and male anxiety about demographic change as relevant factors that might be contributing to this. And they also point out the narrative linking gun violence to mental illness has really narrowed the discussion of gun control so that we are only allowed to speak about gun control in the context of mental illness. So as we are looking for answers when faced with these events, answers are being thrown at us like guns don't kill people, people kill people. But a focus on these may distract us from looking more closely at other forces which are also at play.
Thank you. I think, I heard everything from, the numbness of yet another, or the self-protection of that there's just too much. I can't do that, to the shock, the fear of, was this my community or in my community? Was this perpetrated by someone who shares identities with me, or those kinds of things? So we get wrapped up in that, the fear, the anger. I've heard people relieved that it was not closer to home, whatever the situation was, and then some guilt around that if my first reaction is, at least it wasn't me or mine. What does that mean in terms of caring for others? Never mind the various identities and issues you've all mentioned in terms of being caught up with this. And Dr. Bear, I appreciate kind of some of those facts and figures as we think about it at a university. It's easy to go to the intellectual and the academic and the analysis piece, which can contribute, but we also sometimes shy away from that personal, the human connection piece. As we think about all of these things, the patterns there, our next question was just to think about it can be easy to go to the making sense of. How do we make sense of, maybe as a step toward dealing with it, if not responding, and prevention kind of stuff. And I'm curious, we've referred to a couple of things, but I'm kind of opening up to whoever would like to share first. We see in Atlanta targeted primarily at Asian Americans, particularly at women, so overlap there. In Charleston, in the church in 2015, clearly targeted at a Black or African American community. In 2016, the Pulse nightclub clearly targeted at the LGBT community. There are definitely patterns in these isolated incidents, which I do hear these described as. And yet, as Dr. Bear said, we've got this pattern of there. So there are those. I'm curious, what do you do? What in your academic, in your personal, in your communities, what efforts do you see, or what takeaways do you see in terms of trying to make sense with you, the process of sense making, maybe not the actual solutions? How do you engage with that? Just when faced with all this, the attempt to make sense of the hurt and the pain. Any thoughts on that? And I'll just open it up. Dr. Chen?
Yeah, I think it's important to attempt to make sense of these tragedies, but with caution and nuance. We as humans are wired to attempt to understand patterns. And in addition to that, in the face of uncertainty, we experience anxiety. Anxiety is an emotion that's focused on preparing us for action for a future uncertain event. So when we make sense, or we attempt to understand, we must be careful to not also allow our patterns as we attempt to make sense, we must also not allow our attempts to make sense to stereotype or overgeneralize. So, because on the other end, overgeneralizing can also increase anxiety if you, for example, fear that every grocery store can now be a place of a shooting. So there's this balance to be had in attempting to buoy our understanding of these tragedies in the context that on a large scale, they are rare. So related to something that was on the written prompt was how to support these communities, right? The communities harmed are attempting to make sense of these tragedies on their own. So I think it's important to be able to give support, but also give space. And I think stinger line for me is to not use these communities for your own purposes.
Tim, can I ask you maybe just to say a little bit more about that last statement? How do you mean about not using them?
Yeah, this relates to what I started with, and I was attempting to avoid using left and right and all that. But I noticed, or it felt like early in the earlier months when there was an increase in reported crime, Black on Asian crime, and it felt like that was an attempt by the right to paint something. And then I wonder also about how media paints the Atlanta shooting as opposed to earlier Asian crime or crime against Asians. So I don't know the answer to that, but it feels like my community is being used in some way, no matter what.
So on top of the identities and issues, we then get some politicization of the issues, or issues of media representation or coverage, and that had some great points to add into the mix. Yeah. Other thoughts again about making sense of these issues and incidents and responses.
Yeah, so like you said, I mean, these attacks or these acts of violence are some type of hate or racism or homophobia. And so I think we should try and make sense of it. They're not random attacks all the time. And as humans, like Dr. Chen said, we try to rationalize everything we try to make reason for things. And sometimes we're trying to deem a motive, be it mental illness or someone getting back at communities for foreign policies, or motive being like racism, homophobia, xenophobia, whatever it may be. That the attacks were done for simply someone being different. Sometimes it'll make sense and sometimes it won't. At the end of the day, either way, whether we make sense of it or not, our responsibility as a community, and I think that was the part 2 of the question, is as a community, we have to stand up for injustices no matter what, prioritize healing and community reconciliation no matter what. And then also remembering to encourage the mental wellness in our communities and the well-being of our communities. And then in addition, I'll just throw this in there, and is that just learning about the diverse communities that exist in the US. If you learn a little bit about, one friend's background, know that you'll only know like 1% of what that person's identity or culture is. So do your research and do the work, know your privilege and start within. Check yourselves and your daily actions, your biases, assumptions that you may make, stereotypes that you may hold. For myself, for example, I try to hold myself in check and catch myself when I'm not in my lane, but also find myself having to educate my family and community throughout this, because it has to start within. And I just wanted to mention this, that I recently was part of a community organizing learning session, and they mentioned you have a lane, so stay in it. There is a history, so honor it. There are tools, so use them, and intention does not change impact.
Thank you. Other panelists' thoughts on, again, the need or process to make sense of what we're experiencing? Maria?
Well, as I was hearing everybody talk, it just reminded me, well, my first reaction is like, it doesn't make sense, right? Why would somebody attack a street food vendor or just randomly jump somebody who, appears to be Asian or Latino on the street just because they're walking down the street? It doesn't make sense. But at the same time, I'm reminded that, in especially as a woman of color, as a Latina, you know, our generations don't, like second and third generations don't speak Spanish because our parents were not allowed and they were punished for speaking Spanish when they were growing up, you know, in the United States. And the reason I'm bringing up this story is because we internalize what is going on with us, and at the same time it doesn't make sense, but then it's also that history that we're bringing along with us, like Zahida mentioned, that it makes sense to us and we stay in those lanes. I'm kind of losing my thought here, but it's just a very emotional topic. It's I think about the history coming through and then the way that I try to make sense with it. And I'm so thankful that now more than ever, we're talking about race and gender and intersectionality and how those things are affecting us. But I only see certain populations, I only see certain communities having those discussions that we should be having. And it's been so difficult in the last couple of years not to be able to really, to be able to have discussions with everybody. It was either you were one side or you were on the other. And I think one of the things that we can do, or that, you know, each of us can take the responsibility of, and, you know, I'll echo Zahida, is to have those conversations, but then continue to check yourself, you know, pay attention, listen to people when they're talking about the experiences that not just they went through, but the generations before them went through in this country. There's so much going on right now. And we're not having those discussions out there. We're not yelling and kicking and screaming, and we should. Every time something like this happens, we should be calling so that, you know, those singular phone calls to our representatives can build and become, you know, more of a scream, a movement shaking scream that we're tired of this, that something should be happening. And if we can't come up with solutions, then get your butt in the community and start talking to people to come up with those solutions, so that we can start to make sense of this and how to get out of it. But until we start really doing that and having those collective conversations, and with people that don't always agree with us, you know, we're not going to progress. I wish people would see what my dad would hear, what my dad went through in order to come to this country, to appreciate the reasons that people are coming and going through what they go through, knowing that they're going to be detained in, you know, a freezer box of a detention center, or, you know, be cataloged as illegal or whatever. You know, there's a reason they're going through this. There's a reason our history, people migrate. It's to create a better life. And when we're not understanding the story of the person walking the street next to us, then it's the colonialism, the history of colonialism that continues to warp our vision.
Thank you for sharing again that storytelling. Dr. Baer?
I totally agree with what Maria has just said. I think in crisis situations such as these, it's a natural human response to express incomprehension and disbelief. But do we really have a right to be surprised? Firstly, this type of thing is happening far too often for us to consider it an anomaly. And secondly, we regularly see evidence that these types of hateful attitudes exist in our communities. And it's interesting because we call them hate crimes, right? They're the result of extreme, intense attitudes. But although those attitudes may be extreme, that doesn't mean they exist in isolation. They're simply at the far end of a continuum of negative attitudes towards outgroups that permeate our society. And we can better understand how we might be contributing to these situations if we think about the level of acceptance that we have towards lesser manifestations of hate. So we live in a hierarchical social system which values particular groups and devalues others. And it's commonplace for members of devalued groups to experience negativity in varying intensities on a daily basis. So think, if you're treated with less courtesy than others because of your group membership or receive poor service in restaurants, is that hate? If at work your opinion is not valued, or you're supervised more closely, or you're assumed to have a lower status job, is that something the community should come together to discuss as a crisis? If people assume you're less intelligent, or they're afraid of you, or think you're dishonest because of your group membership, is that hate? If you're unfairly denied a promotion or housing or a loan because of your group membership, should we get together and discuss that as a community? If you're unfairly fired or stopped and searched by the police, is that hate? But we know these things happen as a matter of course for various groups in the social hierarchy, and yet most of these events inspire little or no outrage. And these are forms of violence that are being perpetrated by our fellow citizens every day. So it occurs because at some level, our society accepts and authorizes this mistreatment of certain groups. At the very least, it overlooks this mistreatment. So we have disregard crimes, indifference crimes, crimes of condescension. We have distaste crimes, aversion crimes, crimes of indignity. And we have crimes of contempt, crimes of malice, and hate crimes. At what point are we going to address them? Only when multiple people are killed? So there are systemic and structural forces that authorize and support hate-based violence in all its forms in our society. And don't our institutions perpetrate some of this violence? For example, our criminal justice system, our education system, our financial institutions. And isn't this institutionalized, socially sanctioned violence rooted in our history and the beliefs that we as a society have carried forward from our inception about the worthiness and deservingness and humanity of different groups? So when I think of the issue from this perspective, it makes me wonder, are we a hate crime incubator?
And we'll just close on that. Great question. No, I think for me, Dr. Baer, I appreciate kind of even questioning, what do we mean by violence? Is that just the physical piece? What are the other pieces that can normalize that spectrum along the way? One of our participants, Valerie, asked, kind of building, Tim, on what you said, again, just the overt politicization of this, but is just challenging, that if we get into partisanship, much less left-right, but I think it wonders, even we tend to think about that in terms of response. What's the legislative kind of piece? That's where that comes in. But even the sense making is invested in an ideology. If that's not a specific formal party, that might be something along that political spectrum, and shapes how we even think about what counts as violence or what counts as this. And so again, I just wonder, and Dr. Prince, if you have something to add on that, again, just that even the sense making itself is a loaded set of questions before we can get to any reaction or response.
Absolutely. I think what Dr. Baer so poignantly directed our attention to is that sense making can't be separated from the context. We are fish in water. We are the water around us is made of systems of oppression, and so to make sense is to use that very water in the sense making process. I'm struck too across comments and the sort of human drive for meaning making. I think building on what Dr. Chen was mentioning, I think another human tendency in order to address uncertainty or fear is to also say, well, I would do it differently. I would handle that crisis or the reaction to the crisis differently, because we want to tell ourselves a story that helps us face uncertainty and walk out the door each morning, and that with that comes a real risk of the stereotyping Dr. Chen spoke of, the sort of things that are in the water of these systems of oppression that Dr. Baer spoke of, but it also, I think, risks us losing compassion and grace and a sense of humanity and the diversity of humanity and the different ways that people respond when we flip to, I would handle it this way or that way. And if I may, just one more observation, as Zahida was talking about organizing, and Maria as well, I find myself thinking about power in the organizing sense, like what is our capacity to act? And some of it, to Valerie's question, some of it may be political or legislative sort of power. That may be what a lot of us think about. But power to act comes in many forms. And I think the call for organizing responses and for solutions driven from communities, like that has to be, I think, a foregrounded consideration of ours when we think about politics and action, that there is the politic of what we in our communities can do in terms of our capacity to act.
Other thoughts on that? Again, we've covered quite a bit. I don't want to move on too quickly. Open question, jump when you can. I think for me and for many of us, the a reaction again is to fix. What's the response? What's that piece? And sometimes that moves us too quickly beyond understanding the actual problems, plural, or the impacts, plural. We move too quickly past those pieces. So I wonder, as we think about some of the different issues and dynamics that you've mentioned, thinking about the problems themselves, maybe to begin with the perpetrator, there's a tension between spending too much time and centering that, but again, moving past those problems. In Atlanta, the police chief, I think it was, said the guy was just having a bad day, as if that somehow offset the pattern of Asian and women as targets. In Boulder, we've had the accused shooter as an Arabic name of Syrian descent, and we have had some of our Arab and Muslim, which aren't the same, communities experience some backlash already just in the weeks since that. And so as we think about the identity pieces of this, again, it's easy to go to individual actors, the lone wolf, the bad childhood, the mental health pieces, as if it's isolated in that person. I'm wondering how you engage with the realities of the bigger identities, those community level pieces, in the sense making, in the response, and those kinds of things. Again, people push back and don't want to go there because we don't want to make it about identities, and yet the patterns, the identities are invested. Any thoughts about that? What is it like for us to consider those patterns and those identity levels beyond just the individual level?
I have one thought that I can share a bit. I think more so to do with the idea of the impact that society has on individuals that perpetrate violence. And these are some factors. I mean, thinking about the biases, stereotypes, misogyny, racism, xenophobia, and anti-Black ideas spewed out by the media, the lack of history on BIPOC in the US school curriculum, the overt and covert conversations that happen in our own homes play a massive role in the patterns that we're kind of seeing. So it's just one thought to throw out there.
Dr. Baer?
So in social psychology, research has demonstrated that people frequently have a motive to justify or legitimize the system they live in. And we do this because we want to believe the system is fair and just, even when we're faced with direct evidence of injustice. And this means we may be motivated to justify systemic hierarchies that disadvantage particular groups. that are considered outgroups, non-white racial groups, members of the LGBTQ community, religious minorities, women, people with disabilities. And this system justification can take many forms, including making excuses for perpetrators of wrongdoing and blaming victims of wrongdoing and derogating members of outgroups. And we can see evidence of system justification in responses to events such as the ones you mentioned. If the perpetrator is a member of a valued group, we hear news reports where understanding is expressed and the perpetrator's humanity is considered. He was having a bad day. This justifies the social hierarchy. When the perpetrator is not valued, they are thoroughly denounced, labeled a savage, animal, or thug. No extenuating circumstances are considered, justified the social hierarchy. Similarly, group membership also motivates system justification for victims. Victims of valued high status groups are idealized, innocent, and the event is labeled a tragedy. And people find ways to blame, shame, or pathologize non-valued low status victims. So we see evidence of this in the discussion around the prosecution of George Floyd's murder. Justify the social hierarchy and support the status quo. So race and religious identity definitely play a part in this, in that they provide the false narratives that we use to justify threats to our systems and social hierarchies. They redirect our anger and outrage away from high status perpetrators and temper or drive to punish them. They inspire our indignation on behalf of high status group victims, and similarly our disgust and contempt toward low status group members, perpetrators, get maximum penalties, and low status victims are presented as having through thought, word, or deed somehow contributed to their own demise. So we need to be aware of how this motive might be influencing our reactions to these events. And system justification is also constantly reinforced by the media and other societal institutions. So we need to critically evaluate the events we observe and resist the system justifying messages that we're receiving from the larger society.
Thank you. So the stories themselves are part of those systems that set these up and cause this. One of our audience members, Peter, mentioned, Dr. Blair, your mention about the question of whether we are a hate crime incubator is profound and deserves self-reflection and discussion. And I think, again, you've added to that with, again, the stories we tell of these situations reflect that differential value we place on different groups and individuals. I saw a number of nods around that, others that might like to add in on that.
If I may, in terms of my own research on violence against women and looking at the ways that guns or the threat of guns are used in violent relationships, and then how frequently violence against women is either part of the mass shooting itself or the history of the perpetrator, that evidence for me, as well as other evidence around racism and homophobia, it creates a scenario where I think, connected to Dr. Baer's comments, it becomes impossible for me to think that we're supposed to talk about gun violence or mass shootings in isolation. They do not exist in isolation. And I think when we are encouraged to pause, to not demand things in the aftermath of these events, to not be political about policies that can save lives or not. I think that that's a way that society reinforces the siloing of issues. And when our issues are siloed, there's less capacity for collaborating and acting together. And so I would, I think it's connected to some of Dr. Baer's comments, but I think, Thomas, to your question of should we be thinking about these things together, I think we're terrifically insincere about changing the reality of mass shootings and gun violence in the United States if we are not talking about it as interconnected with these other systems of oppression, because it simply is. And our solutions and our power and our ability as a community is tied up in recognizing those interconnections and finding ways to work together. Of course, recognizing the need for leadership from the communities affected. And I think Dr. Chen early on spoke to the importance of being attentive to who is leading the centering of effective communities. So thank you.
I would like to try to respond to the question by Valerie earlier, in addition to this question about that you presented, Thomas. So I think the way to attempt to connect, at least the way I espouse when I work with couples, is through vulnerability. We're all human. We can understand emotions. When we express emotions, again, defensiveness is reduced. When we can talk about our fears, when we talk about what we feel inadequate about, those connect us because we can all understand those pieces. So how to approach these discussions when the country feels so polarized, it seems to me the direction of emotional vulnerability is a place that could be possible. No answer is going to be completely perfect. Some people are going to be expletive here and still take advantage of your vulnerability. But that seems to work in many spaces, especially spaces like this. So more related to Thomas and thinking about vulnerability, I think it's also important to continue to think of the shooters as human. And this is incredibly hard because in the face of all this pain and loss that people might be feeling, it can be an easy route to kind of demonize. However, if we demonize, if we villainize, we kind of remove our ability to understand them because they become such an other that we don't need to think about why they have done what they have done. We can just say they're bad people, they're evil. And if we don't understand them, I'm not sure if we can build or work towards effectively changing community behavior or how they got there. The shooter in Boulder was apparently bullied. He moved here when I think he was 2. Moved there when he was 2 or 3, but he was apparently bullied in high school, bullied throughout. Did that contribute? Did that have an impact? He reported experiencing, I'm going to screw this up, Islamophobia. Did that have an impact? We must understand these perpetrators to effect change in our communities. And if we demonize them, it makes that so much harder to do.
I think the point of, that they are somehow anomalous was mentioned earlier. That this was they are the broken piece rather than having been produced by systems lets us and those systems off the hook. That this was the aberrant extreme end of the spectrum, not like anybody else. So again, we have no responsibility, can be a real challenge. I wonder in thinking about those conversations, Dr. Chen, you mentioning that vulnerability piece, owning some honesty in terms of the impact of identities. Dr. DePrince mentioned, Zahara, you mentioned the kind of those that starting with self, the everyday conversations in family and small groups. I know for me, growing up as a white guy in Alabama, we didn't talk about uncomfortable subjects like this of any kind. The coping mechanism was to pretend it didn't exist. That avoided any awkwardness, but any self-implication or that vulnerability to the responsibility piece. And so again, I'm wondering just maybe in workplaces, in interpersonal relationships for us here, how much do you see us doing that or ways that we can do that, really kind of starting with our closest circles to not step away from the pain or the problems, but to actually grapple with them towards something constructive. How do you do that? Do you see that? What are some challenges you see in your circles?
I think Southern culture is considered a high context culture, right? And this similarly to Asian cultures that are also considered high context cultures, in which emotion is not generally discussed in order to maintain harmony. And so that may be a space in which those may be spaces in which vulnerability is not something that comes naturally or easily. in which those conversations have to be really sought out, and those relationships have to be really cultivated. And I guess the pithy answer is to just say that it has to start somewhere.
Other thoughts on those challenging conversations? I think about, the workplace, the classroom is a space we aren't supposed to have that kind of emotional versus rational binary. So do you see that? How do you hold those spaces? Again, we're beginning to shift toward the action reaction piece here. Any thoughts on that, Zahida?
I have some thoughts in terms of like the self, and then maybe in family settings. So like personally for me, healing looks like actually taking care of myself, and my mental well-being, and prioritizing self-care, whatever that looks like. I feel like I personally have a duty to mobilize and talk about the issues and be part of the communal healing sessions like this. And but I also know that I don't need to be resilient all the time. And I know that's like a big word, is, be resilient. Communities of color have been resilient forever. We persevere and bounce back. It's a great coping mechanism, sorry. But it's also kind of a systemic issue that I think could take a whole hour to discuss. It's why is it that it has to come to the point of resiliency, right? So, resiliency can help in the face of adversity and tragedy in the moment, but it's also important to kind of think about dismantling those systems that got us there. So that's one aspect. And then last weekend, for example, Nida was part of a healing session for the youth in our community. And I think that's a great place to start, because like Dr. Chen said, it's not talked about. We don't talk about emotion. We don't. It's kind of, there's a stigma around it. So creating those spaces for people that may be experiencing those things or not have a space to talk about it with their families, creating that space for individuals that may need it.
Your thoughts on those conversations, either as, again, I think the reaction healing is after the fact, but what might be the power of some of those conversations? Maria, you mentioned the storytelling piece. If we understood the stories, if we talked honestly about some of the systems, that incubator as a prevention piece as well, rather than just saving it for mopping up and taking care after the fact.
Yeah, and it's hard to say that that after something like this we heal, because another occurrence happens and then that wound opens up again, right? But at the same time, like, we need to understand that we have our community there to support us and bandage us up when we need it. Whether your community is just your immediate family or you have a larger support network, we have to continue to listen with empathy. We have to continue to listen, knowing that your experience is not going to be the same as the other person's, and hearing, taking the time to actually hear what they're saying is extremely important. In my office, every year we send grants out into the community to support integration events where communities can build bridges to really get to know each other. And it's a cultural exchange mostly of the events that happen, but they can be in any level of, maybe civic engagement. It can be social, all kinds of different things. They can be conversations. Take a step out. I before the pandemic, I thought I was more introverted than extroverted. And now I'm finding out, like, during the pandemic, like, I really like being around people. But, so whether you're introverted or extroverted, take a step out into a community that you don't know to hear and listen to those stories of, what their experiences are, what's happening in their country. Read news sources from other places to really, become that global citizen. My grandmother always used to say that, the borders were made by men, because as she traveled with her father to lay the tracks for the trains, she would pass by what was called the border, and the dirt on one side was the same as the other, you know? And depending where you are on the earth and where the equator hits, you know, you'll see vegetation, floral, fauna, the same in different areas of the world. So look for those similarities. I mean, become this global citizen, this person who's connected, not just to the west side of Denver or just to Colorado or the United States, but be that person who's connected to other parts of the world. You don't, I mean, I didn't grow up with money to travel, but you know, luckily I ran into different people, and I was fortunate to have those connections with them where I could travel with them by listening to the stories that they told, whether it was someone in New Mexico or somebody in Uruguay. So I think we have to be open to that and let those stories heal us and connect with each other, not be the lone bystander, not saying a word because you're afraid to get involved. Let's get involved. Let's connect, let's fight for each other and defend each other for what. One of the articles or one of the posts that I saw one time is where somebody was yelling at somebody else and nobody was saying anything. And how lonely can that be? I mean, even as children, we all have had experiences that were similar to that. How often did we wish that somebody would speak up for us? And we can do it in one situation, or we can do it on a larger scale where we're speaking up for the community as a whole.
Thank you. And I'll just say really quickly, we're just at noon. And for those still with us again, we added 30 minutes to the originally scheduled hour. So if you're able to stay with us, please do. Again, the full video recording will be available online shortly. Other thoughts again about these conversations, that storytelling, the speaking up as a way of preventing as well as healing. Dr. DePrince?
This whole conversation, especially Maria's comments, really remind me of what we've learned from survivors of political trauma as well as gender-based violence, and the importance of being recognized and heard and having your story believed, and that healing does involve a communal listening and recognition of impact. And that is really coming to mind, combined with Zahida commenting about that healing is self-care. And I think it's so important too to recognize that, to be prepared to listen. One, I think of, there's a psychiatrist, Jonathan Shea, who talked about his work over many decades with Vietnam veterans. And he described that what it takes to listen to bear witness to stories of trauma is enough strength to be affected, but you have to be affected, but that can't be paired with so much vulnerability that you make it about you, that you're harmed by the listening. And so I'm really struck in this conversation by the importance of listening and storytelling, and then us each doing our own work. I think that's another theme connecting the different parts of the conversation today, so that we're ready to listen in a way that can contribute to healing, that we can be vulnerable and strong enough to not make it about us, that we can center those affected by whatever particular trauma we're talking about at the time.
We are wonderfully off script, so I appreciate the panelists rolling with us on this. We've had one of our participants, Elia, has asked, I would love to know more, or have folks say a little bit more about repair before healing, and what repair communities or conversations can be. And I think that's something that we hear a lot about, and this is politicized in some ways coming off the insurrection at the Capitol, let's just move past it and fix, as opposed to acknowledging the pain or working to actually make right. I just want to, let's go to forgiveness and move past. Again, I think back to my Southern roots that we would skip to that. Let's just, I'm sorry, okay, let's pretend it didn't happen, let's move on. And I think that's an important piece of this, the strength, the vulnerability, those hard conversations about cause, so it doesn't happen again. Thoughts from your own experience, professional settings and communities about, again, that distinction between we need to repair before we can move on. No small questions today, I'm afraid. Do you see that happening? What are some elements that you might seek in those?
Yeah, I wanted to just say that the healing conversations are a type of repair, if you think about it. I mean, you talk about the experiences you've had. It's all part of the healing process. Or repairing process in order to be able to go forward. So I feel like it's all kind of connected in my experience.
When I think about, repair, and I think of restorative justice for the things that have happened in the past, we always want to think of it as something, maybe tangible. But, sometimes it can be something as simple as intangible as, the validation of past hurt, the validation of past acts. And so that's part of the repair, those intangibles that that lead to, a greater understanding of the other community, or of how we can, grow together as well. Other repairs can be, small. There was recently an article about, 5 Latinas who were let go from a news station here locally, and how they were talking about it. And, one situation, or one of the issues was that, the news station and how the terms they use for people who do not have documentation. That small switch to going to people first language versus being, people who are here illegally, those little changes are huge as well. So, when you have a place in those institutions where those little changes, and you have a say where you can speak up and make those little changes in different institutions, that's huge as it, moving towards repair. So, whether you're, opening yourself to those conversations with other people, what are they saying? What do they need? And if you have a place to echo their requests, then do it, but hopefully we can all get to a point where we can, continue to open those doors a little bit wider for communities of color, BIPOC communities, to be in those situations. But until we do, people don't understand how hard it is to get those to that level. So those are just a few things that I thought about in that discussion.
Other thoughts on that repair, healing, connection, distinction? I think about as a white man, talking a lot around privilege, the distinction for me around responsibility versus fault. That the systems are not my fault. I was not here when they were created, but I benefit from them even through no action on my part. And therefore, if I care about the other person or these other communities that I may not belong to, what's my responsibility to want to fix those? So to have some of those hard conversations rather than let guilt if I'm feeling that, to become incapacitating, or recentering myself about, oh, this is hard for me to realize. And so even some of those hard, honest conversations. Dr. Chen, again, I've not been through couples counseling, but I can imagine, again, relationships scaling up, that there's got to be some ownership. And even if, again, it's not my fault, because the relationship is important, I want to own my piece in the fix, whatever that might be. So how do we do that interpersonally? How do we do that at the community level? Becomes a challenge. Yeah, a thought that comes to my mind is that holding both of those. One of our audience members has said, I see a lot about comments of I'm sending our thoughts and prayers, seems to be about moving past without repair. And in instances like this, rather than I will take hard action or own pieces of responsibility. Again, thoughts about that, some of the quick and trite reactions that don't actually make needed change.
I think the thoughts and prayers is a quick, trite reaction on the surface. And I think the iceberg underneath it is back to something Zahida said earlier about the community organizing training you were at recently, and that intention isn't action, or I forget the particular phrasing you used, but I think we've seen over the last year, white people going to book groups, buying up How to Be an Anti-Racist, and the belief that by thinking about these things, it somehow translates into action, and that is very much not the case. So thoughts and prayers I see as a shorthand for a cultural desire or wish, and perhaps especially a white cultural desire, that thinking is the same as dismantling systems of oppression and changing systems that have continued to seed injustice. And it's just not.
I had a friend recently tell me that nice is nice. It's not actually fixing. So I appreciate that, but I'm going to need some more. We are going to need some more than just your nice, or a difference between allyship and friendship is that the friend helps support you after the fact. The ally tries to keep you from being harmed in the first place. So how do we kind of step up the game from the condolence to the prevention piece becomes another part of that. Yeah. As I had to put, intention does not change impact. We've got about 15 minutes. So we're, as we wrap up, saving a few minutes to share resources at the end, and thanks. I'm curious, thoughts that you see, again, if you've got the solution, the magic wand, this is your chance. We will cite you appropriately, but what have you seen? Zahid has mentioned kind of that self-care as part of the change in the healing is important. Again, whether after the fact, the care and the healing, or some of the more prevention, are there some other actionable things you have seen work for you or for those in your communities that you would ask of others to step into, to lean into a little bit more? Dr. Baer?
Yeah, so one of the points that you raised was talking about recentering and how we recenter. And I've been thinking about this as the term recentering almost seems to be what we should be avoiding doing, because the way society is centered is a big part of the problem. And these events are supposed to shake us up and throw us off center and challenge us to confront our reality and reevaluate assumptions and practices. So when we're thinking about these events, what we're aiming for is social change. And this doesn't come from taking the easy road and getting back to life as we knew it. Social change requires us to take an honest look at what lies beneath the pretty facade. So if we're sincere about making change, then we need to face the injustice in our society. We need to be aware of the disparities in our society. We need to recognize how we reward a bully mentality. We need to call attention to greed in our society. We need to acknowledge the privilege in our society. And we need to recognize the false narratives in our society. And we need to call out the immorality in our society. And one of the first steps is to confront and acknowledge the reality of our past and how it influences our present. And Thomas talked about what we can do in schools. Well, we have to be educated about the role our society has played and continues to play in subjugating, exploiting, and vilifying the other. And most importantly, we can accept responsibility and atone for the atrocities that have been committed and the impact that these have had on the attitudes of advantaged group members and the outcomes of disadvantaged group members. And until we do this, everything else is really just lip service. So there's no more space for willful naivete or disingenuous disbelief.
A challenge of if it's not going to be easy. If we're looking for the shortcut, that the point is there isn't one. This is hard work. Yeah. Other thoughts, Dr. Prince?
In addition to there not being a shortcut, I find thinking as a trauma psychologist about the importance of recognizing and healing how diverse our reactions to trauma are, and not assuming there's a single way to healing, there's a single set of reactions, and having compassion and grace with ourselves, as well as that compassion and grace with others, and recognizing not only is there no single path, it's not even a straight path forward, that many times trauma reactions are about an ebb and flow, feeling like you took 2 steps forward and today is worse, and not losing hope at that is part of the human condition in the face of trauma. So I guess I find myself in the broadest sense of healing, thinking about wishing people compassion with themselves and their own reactions and their own ways forward.
So, and thank you all for your thoughts. It brings me back to Cesar Chavez. We just celebrated Cesar Chavez Day this week, and it brings me back to one of his quotes is that, you know, if you want to honor me, organize, right? And I think so often we think that organizing, it takes these big, massive movements, but they're just little steps. They're little steps. I always imagine that, you know, we're in a pond and every little movement we make creates a ripple, and those ripples get bigger and bigger and bigger and touch other ripples of little pebbles that other people are throwing in. And that's how we make change. So that's those are the thoughts that I really have in this area.
What Dr. Prince, what she said there really hit me in a certain way, because in thinking about how this is trauma, what we're doing here, these conversations, it helps us process this stuff. And trauma reactions down the line are greatly heightened when the trauma isn't processed. So having these conversations here, having these conversations in your communities, having these conversations with your loved ones, it helps you hit all the angles, hopefully feel all the emotions you might be feeling, so that stuff doesn't fester down the line.
I think we consider the healing can be that reactive piece. I wonder, maybe just as a final round of thoughts about the prevention work. Again, if today's webinar has not fixed the systems, that incubator, again, Dr. Bear, I'm struck as well by that. that metaphor for me. What's the prevention work we do in terms of the self, with the relationships? Again, Dr. Chen, I'm going to make a presumption here that you don't wait till there's a problem with the relationship to talk about the relationship. So what are we actually engaging with in the community, education-wise, formally, to learn about the past, as we've mentioned, some more honest, hard conversations about that. I saw somebody recently that says, if your history is all sunny, you're not actually studying history. You need to look at the not so great parts. So again, final thoughts from the group about what you do or you would invite others to do. Again, we'll share some resources as well here in a moment in the chat for some of those prevention as well as healing, for getting to know self, engaging with others, especially those who may be different, and that. Thoughts again about that prevention healing work.
I like what Maria just shared in the chat. Self-care is it's so important for prevention. At the same time, I also want to build on what you just said, Thomas, about just, educating ourselves through the process, but also being ready before things happen. There's so many resources, and I think that it's going to be shared as a resource with the group, but Hollaback has these amazing bystander intervention trainings right now, and I think these are things that are out there. They're being created for the community as a great resource for us to educate ourselves. If we're not able to, take the time out to do all the reading, they're really preparing these great trainings for us to learn in a very concise way. So just taking advantage of all the opportunities to learn and be there for when we should be.
And I just dropped the Hollaback has free online bystander trainings that are relatively brief, and they've been doing them some specifically around Asian Pacific Islander, and I think some Arab and Muslim ones as well. Same dynamics underneath all, but topically specific. Other thoughts, again, just about that prevention work that can be healing as we wrap.
I think about prevention work very much in line with Maria's comments about organizing. And I think of organizers such as Adrienne Marie Brown talking about social justice work as imagining a world we haven't known, that the current generation of students that I see at DU hasn't known a world where they don't have active shooter drills and so forth in their schools, and that it is ours to imagine something different, and that's daunting, but that also can be creative and incredible if we can look at the small steps Maria was mentioning in moving change forward, as well as working within and across coalitions. And so I guess there's I don't want to have Adrienne Marie Brown talks in a very compelling way about finding a hopefulness in creating a world that imagining a world we haven't known. So I don't want to create a false sense of hopefulness, or that things are lighter than they are, or that our topic is different than it is today. The realities are exactly as we've described them. And yet, I believe in something we can imagine together that is different. And that's part of prevention too, that hopefulness and that creativity.
Maria, final thoughts? We've got just a minute. I'm going to ask Lene to start dropping some of those resources we've mentioned into the chat. And any final thoughts from our panelists as we close?
Well, I just want to say thank you for the invitation to be here. It was wonderful getting to know all of you and your perspectives. I so appreciate it so much. Lot to think about. But then, also for any of the audience, connect with community. There's so many different organizations that need your help and your participation, getting to know different stories. Casa de Paz is a beautiful organization where you actually get to interact with some of the participants that they house from the detention center, moving on to go see their families. so many different, we work with Lutheran Family Services to provide citizenship workshops and even helping someone, you know, apply for citizenship or apply for DACA. You know, you get to hear their stories and everything they've gone through, their fears. It's a way to kind of open up your world a little bit. So hopefully we get to, if you're interested, I'll put my email in the chat. So, you know, reach out to me and let me know if there's any way that you'd like to get connected to the community. I would love to be a conduit for that.
Any other thoughts? Realizing that we probably have not solved it all. We said we wouldn't, but I appreciate so much our panelists for, on very short notice, giving time to join us and share their perspectives and experiences today. Thank you again to our organizers for making the space, again, just as the next move in that. In higher education, we talk about systems, many fields talk about them, but that systems produce exactly the results they are designed to produce. So if they're producing bad results, they're probably set up that way. And I think about what Dr. Baer said. We've got the systems that are producing these repeatedly, affecting different communities, but still happening. And so if we don't like those disruptions, we still need to disrupt, but for more constructive ends. And so what is that work we each, or in our relationships and our institutions, will put in for disrupting toward better systems that produce better results? And so again, thank you all for joining us today. We hope you will take care of yourself and take care of each other, and lean into some of those harder conversations, some of that harder work, to make a better society, a better experience for all of us. Stay tuned for future Community Plus Values events, including some coming up for some of the Heritage Months we've mentioned in chat. Thank you for joining us, and have a good rest of your day.